There are places on this earth where the sun does not rise for months at a time, where the darkness is not an absence but a presence, a vast and living thing that wraps itself around the land like a blanket of star-studded velvet. And there are places where, in turn, the sun does not set, where the light stretches on in an endless golden afternoon, where time itself seems to pause and hold its breath. These are the lands of the far north, the Arctic regions that crown the top of the world, and they are the homeland of one of Europe's oldest and most resilient indigenous peoples. They are the Sami, and their relationship with this extreme, beautiful, and unforgiving landscape has shaped a mythology unlike any other on earth. The Sami lands, known traditionally as Sápmi, stretch across the northern reaches of 4 modern nations: Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. But these borders mean nothing to the land itself, and they meant nothing to the ancestors who first told these stories. Sápmi is defined not by lines on a map, but by the presence of the Arctic, by the tundra and the taiga, by the great herds of reindeer that move across the landscape in their ancient migrations, and by the northern lights that dance across the winter sky in curtains of green and violet and pale rose. It is a land of extremes, of profound cold and surprising warmth, of darkness and dazzling light, of silence so complete you can hear your own heartbeat, and of winds that howl like the voices of ancient spirits. To survive in such a place requires not just physical resilience, but spiritual understanding. The Sami people have lived in these lands for thousands of years, and their mythology is a direct reflection of their intimate knowledge of the Arctic world. These are not stories told from a distance, abstract tales of gods who live in some far-off celestial realm. These are stories of spirits who live in the rock and the water and the wind, of gods who walk alongside the reindeer herds, of forces that can be felt in every snowflake and every star. Tonight, we journey into that world, into the quiet, snow-covered realm of Sami mythology, where the boundary between the physical and the spiritual is as thin as the ice on a spring river, and where the old gods still watch from the shadows of the pine forests and the depths of the sacred lakes. Our journey into the frozen north begins now, under the cold light of winter stars. To understand Sami mythology, we must first understand the world that shaped it. The Arctic is not a uniform landscape. It is a realm of distinct and powerful environments, each with its own character, its own dangers, and its own spiritual significance. In the far north, beyond the tree line, lies the tundra, a vast open expanse where nothing grows taller than a person's knee, where the ground is permanently frozen just beneath the surface, and where the wind can sweep across the land unobstructed, carrying snow that stings like tiny needles. This is a landscape of incredible harshness, but also of stark, minimalist beauty. In summer, it explodes into life, carpeted with wildflowers and filled with the songs of migrating birds. But in winter, it is a white desert, silent and ancient and utterly unforgiving. South of the tundra lies the taiga, the great boreal forest that rings the northern hemisphere. Here the landscape is dominated by pine and spruce and birch, trees that have adapted to the short growing season and the deep cold. The forest is dense and dark, a place of shadows even at midday, and in winter, when the trees are laden with snow and the sky is gray, it can feel like walking through a cathedral, silent and sacred. The forest provides shelter, firewood, and game. It is where the Sami people traditionally set their traps for fox and marten, where they gathered berries and mushrooms in the brief summer, and where they told their children to be respectful, for the forest is full of spirits, some benevolent and some decidedly not.
And threading through both tundra and taiga are the waters, the rivers and lakes that freeze solid in winter and break into rushing torrents in spring. Water is life in the Arctic, but it is also danger. Thin ice can kill as surely as a blizzard, and the spirits of the water are known to be capricious, jealous, and hungry. The Sami approached every body of water with respect, with offerings, and with the understanding that the water had its own will, its own consciousness, and that it was not always friendly to human intrusion. But the most important feature of the Sami landscape, the element that shaped their entire way of life and their entire spiritual worldview, is the reindeer. The reindeer is not just an animal to the Sami, it is the center of existence, the gift that makes life in the Arctic possible. Reindeer provide meat, hides for clothing and shelter, sinew for thread, bone for tools, and antlers for carving. They provide transportation, pulling sleds across the snow, and they provide wealth, for a family's status was measured by the size of their herd. The reindeer are also the reason the Sami are traditionally a semi-nomadic people, for the herds must move with the seasons, migrating from the inland forests where they winter to the coastal tundra where they summer, and the people move with them. This intimate relationship with the reindeer created a mythology in which the reindeer is not just an animal, but a sacred being, a mediator between the human and the divine, and a gift from the gods that must be honored, respected, and never taken for granted. The reindeer appears again and again in Sami stories, sometimes as a helper, sometimes as a shapeshifter, and sometimes as the earthly form of a deity walking among mortals. In the center of the Sami cosmos, governing all the forces of nature and all the rhythms of life, stood a supreme deity whose name varied across the different Sami regions, but whose nature was constant. In the southern Sami dialects, he was known as Radien, in the northern dialects as Jubmel or Ibmel, and in some accounts simply as the Sky Father or the One Above. He was the creator, the ultimate source of life, the deity who set the sun and the moon in motion and who breathed spirit into the first humans. But Radien was not an active interventionist god in the manner of the Christian deity that would later be imposed upon the Sami. He was distant, transcendent, and largely removed from the daily affairs of mortals. He had set the world in motion, but the actual governance of that world, the management of weather and animals and human fortune, was delegated to a host of lesser gods and spirits. Radien's most direct connection to the world was through his son, a deity known as Radien Ache, or Radien the Father, and through his wife, Radien Akka, Radien's old woman. Together, this divine family formed a kind of cosmic household, a celestial model of the human family structure. Radien Akka was particularly important, for she was the one who received the souls of the dead, who judged them, and who determined whether they would be allowed to enter the realm of the ancestors or would be condemned to wander as restless spirits. She was a stern but ultimately just figure, the cosmic mother who maintained order and balance in the afterlife, just as a Sami matriarch maintained order in the family tent. But while Radien ruled the sky and the cosmic order, the day-to-day spiritual life of the Sami was dominated by gods and spirits who were far more immediate, far more tangible, and far more dangerous. Chief among these was Biegolmai, whose name means wind man or perhaps storm man. Biegolmai was the god of the wind, and in the Arctic, the wind is not just weather, it is a force of life and death. A sudden storm could scatter a herd, freeze a traveler, or destroy a camp. But the wind also brought change, cleared the air, drove away evil spirits, and carried the prayers of the people up to the sky.
Biegolmai was often depicted as a wild, unpredictable figure, sometimes generous and sometimes cruel, depending on his mood. Travelers would make offerings to him before setting out on a journey, leaving a bit of food or a small carved figure at a sacred site, asking for safe passage and calm winds. And when the wind rose to a howl and the snow began to fly horizontally across the tundra, the people knew that Biegolmai was angry, and they would huddle in their tents and wait for his fury to pass, speaking his name only in whispers. Equally important was the god known as Tiermes or Horrigalis, the Thunder God. He was the Sami equivalent of Thor or Zeus, a powerful warrior deity who wielded a hammer or sometimes a bow, and who rode across the sky in a chariot pulled by reindeer or sometimes by goats. The sound of thunder was Tiermes driving his chariot across the clouds, and lightning was his hammer striking down trolls, evil spirits, and other threats to the cosmic order. Tiermes was a protector, a fighter of chaos, and the Sami called upon him in times of danger, in times of illness, and especially when they sensed the presence of malevolent supernatural forces. Sacred sites dedicated to Tiermes could be found throughout Sápmi, usually on high places, on mountain peaks or prominent rock formations where the sky seemed closer and where lightning was most likely to strike. These sites, known as Sieidi in the Sami language, were places of immense spiritual power. They were marked by natural features, a strangely shaped boulder, an ancient gnarled tree, or a spring that never froze, and they were tended by generations of Sami families. Offerings were left at these Sieidi: reindeer antlers, carved wooden figures, silver coins in later times, and prayers were spoken asking for the god's protection and blessing. But the most intimate, the most personal, and perhaps the most important deity in the daily lives of the Sami people was not a god of the sky or the storm. It was a goddess of the hearth, of the home, and of the sacred fire that made survival possible in the frozen north. Her name was Sáhkku, though she was known by many names and many forms across the different Sami regions. She was the fire goddess, but she was more than that. She was the spirit of warmth, of light, of safety, and of the boundary between the ordered human world and the wild, chaotic darkness outside. The fire in a Sami tent, the guati or lavu, was not just a practical necessity. It was a sacred space, a living presence that required constant care and respect. The fire was never allowed to go out completely, for to let the fire die was to invite spiritual disaster, to break the connection with the ancestors, and to leave the family vulnerable to malevolent spirits. Sáhkku lived in that fire, and she watched over the family, protecting them from harm, blessing their food, and ensuring that the tent remained a place of safety and warmth. But Sáhkku was also a demanding presence. There were strict rules about how the fire should be treated. Certain things could never be burned in the fire, trash or anything impure, for that would offend the goddess. The fire must always be fed with respect, and the ashes must be disposed of properly, returned to the earth with a prayer of thanks. And when the family moved their camp, following the reindeer to new pastures, a coal from the old fire would be carefully preserved and carried to the new site, ensuring that Sáhkku traveled with them, that the sacred flame was never truly extinguished.
Women were the primary keepers of the fire, and in this role they were not just performing a domestic task, but fulfilling a sacred duty. The fire was the heart of the home, and the woman who tended it was, in a sense, a priestess, a mediator between the human family and the divine presence that lived in the flames. This gave Sami women a spiritual authority that was profound and deeply respected, even in a society that was, in many ways, shaped by male leadership in hunting and herding. The Sami cosmos was not divided into the neat categories of heaven and earth that we find in some other mythologies. Instead, it was understood as a series of interconnected realms, layered one upon another like the levels of a tent or the branches of a great tree. At the top was the sky realm, the domain of Radien and the celestial gods, the place where the sun and moon lived, and where the souls of the honored dead might eventually ascend. Below that was the middle realm, the world of humans and animals, the physical landscape of tundra and forest and water. And below that, deep beneath the earth and the roots of the mountains, was the underworld, a dark and mysterious place that was home to the dead, to certain powerful spirits, and to forces that were best left undisturbed. But these realms were not sealed off from one another. There were thresholds, liminal spaces where the boundaries grew thin and where movement between worlds was possible. Certain places in the landscape were understood to be such thresholds. The Sieidi, the sacred sites, were one example, but so were caves, deep lakes, and certain ancient trees. And certain times were also thresholds, the transitions between day and night, between seasons, and especially the long polar night and the midnight sun, when the normal rules of time seemed to dissolve. The movement between these realms was the domain of a very special kind of person, the Noaidi, the Sami shaman. The Noaidi was not a priest in the sense of leading communal worship or reciting fixed prayers. The Noaidi was a traveler between worlds, a person who had the ability, through trance and ritual, to send their spirit out of their body and to journey into the other realms. There, they could speak with the gods, negotiate with spirits, retrieve lost souls, diagnose spiritual illness, and gain knowledge that was hidden from ordinary mortals. The path to becoming a Noaidi was not one of choice. It was a calling, often marked by illness, strange dreams, or visions in childhood. A young person who showed these signs would be apprenticed to an experienced Noaidi, learning the songs, the drum patterns, and the techniques of trance. The central tool of the Noaidi was the drum, a wide, shallow frame drum painted with intricate symbols representing the cosmos, the gods, and the spirits. When the Noaidi beat this drum in a specific rhythm, singing the sacred songs known as Joik, they would enter a state of ecstatic trance, and their soul would leave their body and begin its journey. These journeys were not without danger. The other realms were populated by beings who were not always friendly, and a Noaidi could become lost, could be attacked by hostile spirits, or could fail to return to their body. The community would gather around the Noaidi during these trance sessions, protecting their physical body and singing to guide their spirit back home. And when the Noaidi finally returned, gasping and exhausted, they would tell of what they had seen, of the messages from the gods, of the location of lost reindeer, or of the spiritual cause of a person's illness, and what offerings or rituals were needed to restore balance.
The Noaidi occupied a unique and somewhat ambiguous position in Sami society. They were respected, even revered for their power and their knowledge, but they were also feared for they walked in dangerous places and dealt with dangerous forces. A Noaidi who misused their power, who worked harmful magic, or who broke the sacred taboos, could become a source of great danger to the community. And yet the community could not function without them. The Noaidi was the mediator, the bridge between the human and the divine, the one who ensured that the relationship between the Sami people and the spirits of the land remained in balance. The spirit world of the Sami was not populated only by great gods. It was filled, densely populated in fact, with a vast array of lesser spirits, beings who were associated with specific places, specific animals, or specific aspects of life. These spirits were not good or evil in any absolute sense. They were simply powerful, and they had their own needs, their own territories, and their own rules. To live well in the Arctic was to learn these rules, to know which spirits lived where, and to treat them all with the respect they demanded. Among the most important of these were the spirits of the animals. Every species had its own guardian spirit, a kind of master or ruler of that species. The most significant of these was, of course, the spirit of the Reindeer, sometimes called Louis in some traditions, though that name also appears in Finnish mythology with different connotations. The reindeer spirit was the one who decided whether the hunt would be successful, whether the herds would thrive, and whether the reindeer would consent to give their lives to sustain the people. Hunters would make offerings to this spirit before a hunt, asking permission and promising to treat the animals with respect, to waste nothing, and to honor the reindeer's sacrifice. This understanding of the hunt as a negotiation, as a sacred exchange rather than a simple act of taking, was central to Sami spirituality. The animal was not a mere resource. It was a spiritual being, and its death was a gift that created an obligation. The bones of hunted animals, especially the skull and certain other sacred bones, had to be treated with great care. They were often returned to the forest or the water, placed in trees or sunk in lakes, ensuring that the animal's spirit could be reborn and that the species would continue. To fail in this duty, to disrespect the bones, or to waste the meat, was to offend the animal spirits and to risk that they would withdraw their gift, that the reindeer would disappear, and that the people would starve. There were also spirits of the landscape itself. Every significant feature of the land, every mountain, every lake, every river, had its own spirit, its own presence. Some of these spirits were benevolent, protecting travelers and blessing those who showed respect. Others were indifferent or even hostile to human presence. The Sami learned the character of these spirits through generations of experience, through stories passed down from the elders, and through the guidance of the Noaidi. A family traveling through unfamiliar territory would move carefully, making small offerings at likely spots, speaking respectfully, and watching for signs of spiritual displeasure. Water spirits were particularly feared. The spirit of a lake or river, sometimes called Chahtsaravga, or simply the waterman, was a powerful and jealous being. These spirits were known to demand offerings, and if they did not receive them, they might cause drownings, they might spoil the fishing, or they might send sickness to the families living nearby. Children were warned never to play too close to the water's edge, never to swim alone, and never to speak disrespectfully about the water. And when someone did drown, which was not uncommon in a land of lakes and rivers, it was understood that the water spirit had claimed them, and that their body might never be recovered, for the spirit kept what it took.
There were also spirits of the home and the family. These were ancestors, but not in the distant abstract sense. These were recent dead, grandparents and great-grandparents whose names were still remembered, who had lived in the same lands, followed the same reindeer herds, and who maintained an active interest in the welfare of their living descendants. These ancestor spirits lived in the land itself, in the burial sites and the sacred places, and they could be called upon for help, for guidance, and for protection. But they could also be offended if their descendants failed to live honorably, if they broke the old taboos, or if they forgot to make the proper offerings. The ancestors expected to be remembered, to be honored with gifts of food and drink, and to be consulted in important family decisions. A family that neglected its ancestors was a family in spiritual danger, vulnerable to misfortune and to the malevolent spirits that were always watching for weakness. The Sami year was not measured by a calendar of arbitrary months. It was measured by the rhythms of nature, by the movements of the reindeer, the cycles of light and darkness, and the changing of the seasons. And each of these transitions was marked by rituals, by offerings, and by a heightened awareness of the spiritual forces at work in the world. The most dramatic of these transitions was, of course, the shift between the polar night and the return of the sun. In the far north, above the Arctic Circle, the sun does not rise at all for a period in midwinter. The darkness is total, broken only by the moon, by the stars, and by the shimmering curtains of the northern lights. This was a time of profound spiritual significance, a time when the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin, when spirits walked more freely, and when the people had to be especially careful in their conduct. The return of the sun, when the first sliver of light appeared on the horizon after weeks or months of darkness, was a moment of joy, of relief, and of deep spiritual gratitude. Offerings were made to Biegolmai and to Radien, thanking them for bringing back the light, for ensuring that the world had not been permanently consumed by darkness. And the people knew that with the returning sun came the promise of summer, of life, and of the reindeer calves that would be born in the spring. Summer itself, though brief, was a time of intense activity and intense spiritual focus. This was when the reindeer calves were born, and the survival of the herds depended on the weather, on the health of the mothers, and on the favor of the spirits. The calves were marked, a ritual that was both practical, establishing ownership, and spiritual, welcoming the new generation into the community and asking for the protection of the reindeer spirit. This was also the time when families gathered for larger communal rituals, when the Noaidi would drum and journey, and when important decisions about the movement of the herds and the strategies for the coming year would be made. Autumn was a time of preparation, of slaughter, and of gratitude. As the days grew shorter and the first snows began to fall, the reindeer were brought down from the summer pastures, and a portion of the herd would be culled. This was necessary, for not all the animals could survive the winter, and the meat had to be stored, dried, and frozen to sustain the people through the long, dark months ahead. But this slaughter was never undertaken lightly. It was a sacred act, accompanied by prayers and offerings, and the animals chosen were thanked for their sacrifice. Their spirits were honored, and their bones were treated with the respect due to beings who had given their lives so that the people might live.
Winter, the season of darkness and cold, was a time of storytelling, of rest, of careful conservation of resources, and of constant vigilance against the spiritual dangers that intensified in the dark. This was when the old stories were told and retold, when the children learned the names of the gods and the spirits, when they learned the songs and the proper ways of speaking to the divine. The long winter nights, gathered around the fire in the gyoti, with the wind howling outside and the snow piling high against the walls, were the crucible in which Sami culture and Sami mythology were preserved and transmitted from one generation to the next. One of the most distinctive and beautiful aspects of Sami spirituality is the joik, a form of vocal expression that is unlike anything else in world music. A joik is not exactly a song, at least not in the way most cultures understand song. It is more like a sonic portrait, a musical evocation of a person, a place, an animal, or a feeling. To joik someone or something is to capture their essence in sound, to create a melody and a rhythm that is inseparable from the subject itself. Joiks are deeply personal. Each person has their own joik, created for them by a family member or by someone who knows them well. And these joiks are passed down, becoming a kind of living archive of family history and identity. But joiks are also spiritual. The Noaidi used joiks in their shamanic journeys, singing the joiks of the spirits to call them, to honor them, and to guide the soul through the other realms. The joik of the reindeer was sung during hunts and during calving season. The joik of the Rind was sung to calm a storm, and the joik of a dead person was sung to honor their memory and to help their spirit find peace. The joik is a sound that emerges from the landscape itself, from the wind and the silence and the vast open spaces of the Arctic. It is often performed without words, just pure vocalization, and it has a haunting, almost otherworldly quality that seems to bypass the conscious mind and speak directly to something deeper. To hear a traditional Sami joik, especially one sung by an elder in the stillness of a winter night, is to understand something fundamental about the Sami relationship with their world. It is a relationship built not on domination, but on participation, on the understanding that humans are not separate from nature, but are simply one voice in a vast and complex chorus. The arrival of Christianity in Sápmi, beginning in earnest in the medieval period and intensifying during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, was a catastrophe for traditional Sami spirituality. The Christian missionaries, both Catholic and Leader Lutheran, viewed the Sami religion as paganism, as devil worship, and as an obstacle to salvation. They set about systematically suppressing it, destroying drums, outlying the Noaidi, burning sacred sites, and punishing those who continued to practice the old ways. The destruction was not just physical, but cultural and spiritual. The drums, those sacred objects that were the Noadi's primary tool, were confiscated and burned by the hundreds. The Sieidi, the sacred offering sites, were desecrated, their accumulations of antlers and carvings cleared away, and sometimes replaced with Christian crosses. The Noaidi themselves were persecuted, accused of witchcraft, and in some cases executed. The old stories were suppressed, labeled as superstition and lies, and children were punished for speaking of the gods or for singing the Joiks.
But despite centuries of persecution, despite forced conversion and cultural suppression, the Sámi people did not completely abandon their spiritual heritage. The old knowledge went underground, preserved in secret, passed down in whispers, and maintained by those families who lived in the most remote areas where the reach of the church and the state was weakest. The stories were still told, but now they were told carefully, framed as fairy tales or as historical accounts, rather than as living religious truths. The Joiks were still sung, but now they were sung without explanation, their spiritual significance hidden beneath the surface. And in some families, in some communities, the old practices continued. Offerings were still made, though now they might be hidden or disguised. The Sieidi were still visited, though now the visitors came in secret, in the dark, making sure they were not observed. The relationship with the reindeer, with the land, and with the spirits was maintained, not through public ritual, but through private devotion, through a quiet, stubborn refusal to completely abandon the ways of the ancestors. In the 20th century, as indigenous rights movements gained strength around the world, the Sámi people began to reclaim their cultural heritage more openly. There was a revival of interest in the old stories, in the Joiks, and in the spiritual traditions that had been suppressed. Scholars began to collect and publish the myths that had survived, working with Sámi elders who still remembered the old ways. Artists and musicians began to draw on traditional themes, creating new works that honored the past while speaking to the present. And some Sámi people began to explicitly identify as practitioners of the old religion, reconstructing rituals, honoring the gods, and teaching the next generation about their spiritual heritage. This revival is not without controversy or complication. Much has been lost. The unbroken chain of Noaidi, passing their knowledge directly from master to student, was severed. Many of the specific rituals, the exact words of prayers, and the detailed meanings of symbols are gone, scattered like snow in the wind. What remains is fragmentary, a collection of stories, descriptions from historical documents written by outsiders, and the living memory of practices that were never meant to be written down. But what has survived is powerful. The core understanding, the fundamental relationship between the Sámi people and the land, between humans and spirits, between the living and the dead, that has endured. And it continues to shape Sámi identity, Sámi art, and Sámi resistance to cultural assimilation, even in the 21st century. The Northern Lights, the Aurora Borealis, hold a special place in Sámi mythology and in the Sámi imagination. These shimmering curtains of green and violet and rose that dance across the winter sky are not just a beautiful natural phenomenon. They are understood as a manifestation of spiritual power, as a visible sign of the activity of the other realms, and as a presence that must be treated with respect and caution. Different Sami communities had different beliefs about what the Northern Lights actually were. In some traditions, they were understood as the spirits of the dead, dancing in the sky, celebrating or fighting or playing games. In other traditions, they were seen as a kind of fire, a celestial flame that could be dangerous if approached incorrectly. Children were often warned not to whistle, not to wave, and not to speak too loudly when the lights were visible, for fear of attracting their attention. The lights were powerful, and like all powerful things in the Sami world, they were not to be trifled with. There is a particular story, told in various forms across Sápmi, about a great fox whose tail sweeps across the snow and creates sparks that fly up into the sky, becoming the Northern Lights. The Finnish word for the aurora, reventulet, literally means foxfires, and this image of the fox, a trickster and a liminal creature, creating beauty and mystery with a sweep of its tail, captures something essential about the Sami understanding of the natural world. The world is full of wonders, full of beauty, but that beauty is always tinged with danger, with the understanding that the forces at work are beyond human control, and that they must be approached with humility and respect. To stand beneath the Northern Lights on a clear Arctic night, with the snow crunching underfoot and the stars blazing overhead, and the silence so profound it feels like a physical presence, is to understand viscerally why the Sami people understood their world as sacred, as alive, as filled with spirits and gods. In such a moment, the boundary between the physical and the spiritual dissolves. The lights are not just photons and magnetic fields, they are presences, they are voices, they are the visible proof that there is more to reality than what can be measured and weighed. As we reach the end of our journey through the frozen landscapes and ancient stories of Sami mythology, we are left with a profound sense of both loss and hope. So much has been lost, the drums burned, the Noaidi silenced, the sacred sites desecrated, and the stories interrupted. The systematic suppression of Sami culture, carried out over centuries in the name of civilization and salvation, was an act of cultural violence whose scars are still visible today. But the stories have not been completely silenced. The gods of the frozen north, Radien and Tiermes, Biegolmai and Sáhkku, have not entirely departed. They live on in the memories of the elders, in the words of the storytellers, in the melodies of the Joiks, and in the hearts of those Sami people who still feel the pull of the old ways. They live on in the land itself, in the mountains and the lakes, in the forests and the tundra, in the reindeer herds, and in the dance of the Northern Lights.
The Sami people have survived as a distinct culture for thousands of years, longer than most of the nations that have tried to assimilate them. They have survived the medieval kingdoms, the Lutheran state churches, the colonial exploitation, and the modern pressures of globalization. And their mythology, their spiritual understanding of the world, has been a key part of that survival. It has given them a sense of identity, a connection to their ancestors, and a framework for understanding their place in the vast and beautiful and dangerous Arctic world. Today, there is a growing movement among the Sami to reclaim and revitalize their spiritual traditions. Young people are learning the Joiks, are visiting the old sacred sites, and are seeking to understand what it means to be Sami in the modern world while still honoring the wisdom of the ancestors. Scholars and artists are working to preserve and share the stories,
to ensure that they are not lost to future generations. And activists are fighting for Sami rights, for control over their traditional lands, and for the recognition that the Sami are not a relic of the past, but a living people with a living culture that has much to teach the modern world. For the Sami understanding of the relationship between humans and nature, the understanding that the land is sacred, that animals are spiritual beings, and that we are all part of an interconnected web of life, is a wisdom that the world desperately needs. In an age of climate crisis, of environmental destruction, and of profound disconnection from the natural world, the Sami myths offer an alternative vision. They remind us that the earth is not a resource to be exploited, but a living presence to be honored. They teach us that every mountain, every river, every animal has its own spirit, its own value, and its own right to exist. And they show us that it is possible to live in one of the harshest environments on earth with grace, with beauty, and with a deep and abiding reverence for the sacred. And so as we close this chapter, as we step back from the snow-covered landscapes and the star-filled skies of the Arctic, we carry with us the knowledge that the old gods are not dead. They are still there, in the silence of the tundra, in the whisper of the wind through the pines, in the crack of lake ice in spring, and in the ethereal dance of the northern lights. They are waiting, patient and eternal, for those who still have the eyes to see, the ears to hear, and the humility to approach them with respect. The spirits of the North are ancient, they are powerful, and they will endure as long as there are people who remember their names and who are willing to honor the sacred contract between humans and the land that sustains them.